I think it's time for us to begin. Welcome. This is our second session of our webinar on racism with Drick Boyd. And welcome to all of you. We hope there will be a few more joining us here yet as we go along. We were blessed with our first session a week ago and look forward to another good session tonight. Let's just start with a word of prayer. We thank you, dear Lord, for the activities of this day. We thank you for bringing us together as your people to learn and to think about our prejudices and how they affect our relationships and many aspects of our lives. We ask you bless our presenter this evening as he shares with us, and bless our discussions and guide our thoughts and understanding. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I would like to, for the sake of those who may not have been here last time, I will give the full introduction to our presenter again. Drick Boyd is Professor Emeritus of Eastern University, where he taught courses in urban theology, leadership, social justice, and race and ethnic relations in the Department of Social Transformation. He's been active in social justice organizations, addressing issues such as gun violence prevention, fair funding of public schools, and gentrification. He's the author of 3 books. He's the father of 3 adult children. He lives in Broomall, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia with his wife, Cynthia. And he is a member of West Philadelphia Mennonite Fellowship. So we will turn it over to Drick for his presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Good to be back with you. Something that I should have done last week that I'd like to do this week before I begin is kind of hear where people are zooming in from. So I have Chris, you're from South Dakota, right?
Right.
And then I see the name Dave Nickel. Dave, where are you coming in from? He's got to unmute himself here.
Right.
We're from Lincoln, Nebraska.
Lincoln, Nebraska. All right, very good. And then East Union Mennonite Church?
Yes, we're from Kelowna, Iowa.
Okay. Where is Kelowna in relationship to like Des Moines?
About an hour and a half from Des Moines, south of Iowa City, about 20 minutes, or 20 minutes from the Interstate 80.
Okay.
30 minutes.
All right. Yeah. So, and then, okay. And Jack and Ruth, where are you coming in from?
We are from Bruning, Nebraska. We attend the Shickley Mennonite Church in Nebraska.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. SMC, what? I don't know, that must be a church of some sort. SMC.
Salem Mennonite Church, Freeman, South Dakota.
Wonderful, wonderful. Susan, where is Susan coming from?
I'm one of the conference ministers for Central Plains, and I'm coming to you from my home in Tiffin, which is just outside Iowa City.
Wonderful. And Stuckey R? The Stuckeys? All right, did I get everybody? Did I get a...
No, you missed West Union.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're neighbors to East Union from Kelowna, Iowa City, Parnell area.
Okay, so there's kind of a Mennonite concentration right around the Union area, huh? Kelowna area, yeah.
We're from Rochester, New York, of a transplant from Lincoln, Nebraska.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, welcome, welcome. You're on my time zone then, so this is a little later for you. So some of you may, the connection that led me to even be here tonight was through a man named Joseph Givens, who's from St. Paul, Minnesota, and who's also on the committee that planned this. And Joseph is a student of mine in the Urban Studies program, and that's how I made the connection. But I bring that up because Joseph hasn't been able to be with us. About 2 weeks ago, he learned that his mother was near the end of her life. She had been declining for quite a while. And so about 2 weekends ago, she passed away. And about 2 days after she had died, they took his father to the doctor because he had been having some issues and discovered that he had a tumor in his brain, a very advanced tumor. And so Joseph hasn't been able to be on this video in large part because he and his family are contending with the death of his mother and the next question of what to do with and for his father. So he's part of your Central Plains group and thought you might want to know that, both because he's the reason, or he's the reason I'm here, but also because I'm sure you'd want to know that. One of the things that I would like to try to do tonight that is a little different than last time is to be a little bit more interactive. And so I want to start by just doing a very brief review of some of the highlights of what I talked about last time, but then move into talking about how racism, or how we as white people often react in situations where race is an issue or where there are, cross-racial relationships. And much of what I'm going to share is based on a book by a woman named Robin DiAngelo, a book entitled White Fragility, which is an excellent book. But she makes a lot of statements that some of which I'm going to share with you, but I want to give you a chance to respond. So I'm hoping that you will feel so moved at different points when I stop and sort of say, well, what do you all think? Now, this is a statement she makes, but what do you all think? So that it's not just me sort of talking, but that maybe we can have a little bit more of a conversation. But let me start by giving a little bit of a review of some of the things that I talked about last time, just to kind of make sure we're sort of on the same page. Let me get me up here. So, and I've been calling this series Musings of a Recovering Racist. I don't pretend to be an expert, but one, like all of you, I suspect is, a fellow traveler on this journey toward becoming a person who really cares about people of all races and who shows that in concrete ways. So I started last week by saying this was going to be an uncomfortable conversation, and we'll actually get in a little bit more deeply into why this is often an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. But I just say up front that this is not easy for many of us who are white to talk about. And I put myself in this category. I have taught courses on race and racism for over 2 decades. I've done workshops, I've done a few events like this, and I'm always challenged because it really forces me to step back and take a look at myself and kind of where I'm at. So I understand the difficulty, and I just want to acknowledge that. I then made the point, gave a quote by this man, Richard Wright, who was an author in the middle of the 20th century, who was asked what he thought of the Negro problem. And he responded by saying, there isn't a Negro problem, there's a white problem. And so, and I use that as sort of a starting point to say that while there are many different ways we could talk about racism, and certainly understanding the struggles and the pains and the history of people of color is an important part of this. But what I want to focus on in this series is really those of us who are white. And so our purpose tonight is not to try and understand, everything about Black people or Mexican people or Chinese people or Hmong people or Native Americans, but really to try and understand ourselves and how this topic of race impacts us on a very deep and personal level. I then talked for a while about the different dimensions of racism, that racism isn't just what we often think of as the interaction between two people where words are said or things are done that are racially discriminatory. That's certainly a part of racism, but it's not the only part. And so I talked about the intrapersonal, which is that which goes on inside of us, our attitudes, our feelings, our stereotypes. The interpersonal is how we interact with people of different races, and even how we interact with other white people around the topic of race. And then I talked about institutional, which has to do with organizations and how going back many years, organizations have established patterns and policies and practices that often are still at work today. And when you're a part of that organization or part of that institution, it's the norm. You just say, well, that's the way we do things around here. That's the way we think around here. And very often embedded in institutions are racist practices and racist policies that very subtly but very really discriminate on the basis of people's race. And then finally, I talked about systemic racism, which has to do with the interplay of institutions. And so you have things like the criminal justice system or the educational system, which are a network of many different institutions that together have developed a pattern that often excludes and degrades people of other races and gives unfair access and sometimes privilege to those who are white, often without those white people being aware that there is even discrimination going on. So I'm not saying that this is always overtly intentional, but the fact is it still happens. And that's why we need to take a look at it. And then I said that this interplay of the intrapersonal, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic dimensions of racism have created a culture which I referred to as whiteness or white supremacy. And culture is something that all of us, regardless of our race, we are swimming in it. We are shaped by it. It develops our norms and what we believe to be true and we believe to be real. And what is happening is so often in this culture, it has created a situation where many white people have been socialized simply to believe that they go about their way the way they do, and are not aware of the forces of discrimination that have given them unfair access and unfair privilege. And so it's not that people are going around stealing something from someone, but it's something that they've been given that has not been given to people of color very often. And we see this culture, the reality of this culture in all sorts of statistics which have to do with the discrepancy between, say, Hispanics and Blacks and whites in terms of average income or the accumulated wealth, or looking at the criminal justice system, how two people, one white, one Black, can commit the same crime and have vastly different sentences. And that this doesn't just happen every once in a while, but it's a very real pattern that is repeated again and again and again. And so part of our struggle as whites in this whole discussion around racism is to try and understand the way in which that culture has shaped us and what we need to do to maybe unlearn and then relearn certain things. And I close by sharing this diagram that comes from the book Set Free, which was written by some 3 Mennonites about racism. And they talk about how at the very root, if this iceberg is a symbol of racism, at the very root of racism is its power to shape our sense of ourselves, our identity, how we see ourselves and how we see others. And it was really at that point that I stopped and said that this is what we want to look at tonight, that how has racism shaped us as white people, very often without our being fully aware of what's happened. And I also said that when I talk about racism, I'm not talking about an accusation. I'm not saying that people are inherently bad. What I'm saying is that this is a condition. This is a description of the forces that have shaped us. And once we become aware of those forces, then we're in a position to decide whether we're going to flow with them or we want to work against them and try to unlearn some things that we can, so we can become more, live more in solidarity with people of color and some of their struggles. So those were the things that I talked about last week. And then throughout it, I said that I referred to myself as a recovering racist, that I don't approach this topic as if I've sort of got it all figured out, but that like a recovering addict, racism is my drug. And so as a recovering addict, I must continually work on my attitudes, my actions, the way I think, the way I act, the way I relate to people, the words I use. And so what I share with you is in many ways what's come out of my own journey in this whole area. So that's really where we were last time at the end. But I wanted to start tonight, and this is where the interaction begins to come in. I wanted to ask you to give some thought to a series of questions, and then if you're so moved, I invite you to share some of your thoughts on this question. So, and these are questions that I often use with my students when we begin talking about race, because it helps us begin to think about how we first learned about this topic. So my first question is, at what age did you first become aware of the idea of race? When was that a concept or an idea that occurred to you? And what was the occasion that may have brought that to your attention? So what age did you first become aware of the idea of race? When did you first encounter a person of another race? Is there a time you can remember when you first encountered someone of another race? And these first two questions might very well have been the same instance, but not necessarily. The third question is, what sort of messages did you receive from the adults in your life about people of other races? You know, these sorts of things were shaped at a very early age. And so can you think about things that were said or done, or books that you were exposed to, or ideas you were exposed to with regard to people of other races? And then finally, when did you first experience or witness racial discrimination? When did you first experience or witness racial discrimination? So for me, these first two questions really are the same incident. I was about 10 years old, and I was running in a park in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a park called Minnehaha, and it was a big park, and I was running around, and I came upon a little African-American boy, and he was about my same age, and we talked for a few minutes, and I can still remember vividly that experience, because he was, in my mind, he was so dark-skinned that I'd never come across someone that dark-skinned, and he had a Southern accent, and I had a hard time understanding him. But it was, whoa, this person is not like the other people that I know. And I was probably 10 years old. It wasn't a long experience, but it was something that still sticks with me. And when I think of the messages that I received from the adults in my life, there were a lot of jokes and a lot of stories that were demeaning to Black people, demeaning to Japanese people, demeaning to Jewish people, but I never was told directly something about those people. It was more subtly in the jokes and the stories that people would tell. And then in the last time, when did I first experience or witness racial discrimination? It actually wasn't until I went to college. I went to college down in North Carolina in the early 70s, when segregation, while it was not legal, was still very much in play. And I remember I was tutoring a young boy at a Black church, and there was a professor at the college who would drive us to this church. And one day he couldn't go, and so a group of us said, "Oh, we'll just walk." It was only about a mile away. And as we walked on the road, we came to a place where the road continued, but the pavement stopped, and the road became a dirt road. And I just remember thinking, when I saw that divide, I said to myself, "Oh, this is what segregation is." I had a sort of abstract idea, but that was very concrete, and it was my first real awareness of what racial discrimination looked like. And so those are some of the formative things in my life that began to make me think about these things. And wondering if you might take a minute and just think about for yourself the answers to some of these questions, and if someone would be willing to share, it would be interesting to hear others' experiences. So does anyone have any answers to these questions that you might be willing to share with us? Oops. Someone wrote thoughtless, derogatory terms, songs, and jokes. That must have been an answer to the question, what sort of messages did you receive? Thank you. You can just speak it out too.
My name's Tom Fleming. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
From West Union. I grew up in a home where my father was racist, my mother wasn't, so I became painfully aware, I think around the age of 10, when my dad would come home from work using the N-word, and my mother would say, no, we're not going to talk about people that way. And so that answers kind of the first two questions. And then, of course, I had to choose which way am I going to go. And with the Jesus story, it was pretty clear which way. And that's pretty much the first three. My first experience when I was a sophomore in high school, I was sitting at a basketball game when an adult about 2 or 3 rows behind me started yelling the N-word, get that guy on the other team, because he was scoring too much. And this went on probably 4 or 5 times, get that guy. And finally I got tired of it at the age of 15, stood up, turned around, looked at him and said, some of us don't appreciate that kind of language here. And that was the end of it, of his language, except one more time. 15 or 20 or 30 minutes later, he said something about the N lover down there, referring to me.
Yeah.
And well, I've been to Africa for 5 years, have lots of Black friends, and this is a very germane topic for me as well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? So someone wrote, my first encounter with people of other races were the fresh air children who came to stay on our farm for the summer. I was probably 6 or 7. Rita from Gulfport, Mississippi, and Jackie from Chicago stayed with us different summers. Discrimination as a teen, our church hosted a Laotian refugee family. We took them swimming at a local lake one day and heard all kinds of discriminatory remarks. Thank you. For those of us who don't know what the Fresh Air program is, could someone tell us what the Fresh Air program is or was? What was the Fresh Air program?
You know, kids came up from the city to live in the country.
Oh, kids came out just for the summer. I see. Okay. And these was hosted through churches, or how did they make the connections? Do you know?
Yep. Programming to sign up
for. Someone said, I think through churches. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I've heard about that, but that's great. So, and those were, you know, it was interesting. We thought there were a lot of those kind of programs back in the 60s and 70s. And we thought that we were helping these kids from the inner city to come out and enjoy the country, which they were. But the other thing that I think we realize now, for many of us, it gave us maybe our first opportunity to interact and get to know people of other different races. So it may have been an unintended consequence, but it was a good consequence that some of those programs also impacted us in a positive way. So those are good. So these are important questions, and in the sense that they begin to help us think about how our own attitudes and emotions were shaped as we grew up. And like most things in life, we absorb so much as a young person, not being fully aware of it. And it's not until we're a little bit older that we realize, oh, this is the way I've been thinking. This is the way I've been acting. These are the things I've been saying. And then we have a chance to sort of step back and think about, well, is that the way I want to live my life? And part of the process of becoming aware of the impact of racism on our lives is doing this kind of self-reflection, not only about the early stages of our life, but all those significant encounters we've had that have made us who we are. I forget your name, but the man who spent years in Africa, that must have been very formative for you, I would think.
Yes. So I wanted to just make a comment about fresh air. It's also been documented that there were sexual and psychological abuse on the part of white people during that era.
Oh, that's sad.
It was theoretically good, but it had some real downsides too.
Oh, no, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, yeah, unfortunately, there's too much of that. We're now finding out, and all sorts of things. Okay, so I wanted to, before we start talking about white fragility, I do want to acknowledge that at times people feel like when I talk about this, that I'm just lifting up race and not acknowledging that there are all sorts of discrimination that goes on, and that people who may be in a position to discriminate in one place are, in another part of their life, are subjected to discrimination. And this complexity of isms, if I can call it, is often referred to as intersectionality. And what this chart is trying to show is some of the ways in which intersectionality works. There are many different aspects to our identity, and depending on who we are, we may either be in socially a dominant position or a socially subordinate position. So, we've been talking about race, and so we've been talking about how whites tend to be in the dominant position and people of color tend to be subordinate in our culture. But we could also talk about gender. And there we see that men tend to have more power and more influence and more access to resources than women. That men and women do the same job, and yet women repeatedly and as a pattern earn less and get promoted less. We might talk about socioeconomic divisions. So those who are wealthy and middle class certainly are looked upon and with higher favor than those who are working class and poor. We can look at physical ability, the able-bodied and the physically challenged. Education, college educated people tend to get preference and tend to get doors open to them that high school had graduates and even dropouts don't. There's ageism, that the very young and the very old tend to be discriminated against and dismissed often much more than those who are in the middle range. And then we have, mental health, and people who are mentally challenged, who struggle with mental illness, often are stigmatized. And what's important to see in this is that in any one of these, we may be in the dominant column or we may be in the subordinate column, and that all of us in one way or another experiencing both a sense of privilege and being in the dominant category, and at the same time in other areas are subordinate. And so racism isn't the only area in which we need to look at these issues, but in our culture, in our history, race has had the greatest impact on a person's ability to, quote, get ahead in society. And so we're talking about race, not because it's the only form of discrimination, but we're talking about because whiteness and racism are still the strongest influence in so many areas of our nation's life and in our culture's life. So, we have to kind of think in terms of where we've come from. As we look at our history, Native Americans were here long before the Europeans, and yet were pushed out in many ways. Whole tribes were wiped out with disease, and many Native American tribes were pushed west from their native lands. And even today, they are just a small percentage in terms of overall population of what they were when they first encountered the Europeans. And then, of course, the history of slavery, which then, after the Civil War, slavery became illegal, and yet Jim Crow happened, there was lynching, and it wasn't well into the 20th century. Black people were having to go to the back of the bus, they were having to drink out of different water fountains. They were often not allowed to vote in certain cities. In the North, very often there were housing covenants that basically forbade people in an all-white community to sell their homes to a person of color. So there were many ways in which, well into the 20th century, Black people were legally sanctioned from certain things that were just normal and acceptable to most white people. And so we've come from that history, and we've come a long way, and it's not something we should look down upon. We are in a much better place than we were 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. But at the same time, we are in a very unique historical moment, I think. We still have laws on the book in 2020 that discriminate on the basis of race. Overt racism was less acceptable after the Civil Rights Movement, and yet there seems to be a dramatic increase in white nationalist activity. And so in response, you've been seeing the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter, which is sort of the 21st century version of the Civil Rights Movement in many ways. You've seen in the news a lot about police brutality against persons of color. And so you have people putting signs on their lawn say Black Lives Matter, others say Blue Lives Matter. And there's something that's going on in that we need to take seriously. As I mentioned last week, there are states right now that are making moves to make it more difficult for poor people, for people of color, for seniors to vote by closing voting stations, by making them at far distances. In Alabama, in Georgia, in Florida, there are laws that are being passed that are specifically designed to make it difficult for people of color to vote and participate in our civil society. So we are in this very unique moment where we've had a period of time when it seems like things were moving along and we were improving, but there's been a backlash. And I think it's one of the reasons that conversations like this are happening and need to happen, because people are saying, wait a minute, I thought we'd solve some of these things. And yet here we are, we're contending them in a new way, in a new era. So much of what I want to share comes from this book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. And I want to use this book as a way to start taking a look at how we've been socialized and to think and to feel about people of different races and what we can do about it. And most of what I'm going to share comes from this book. And it's really the subtitle of this book that I think says it all. Why is it so hard for white people to talk about racism? Black people and brown people talk about race and racism all the time because they're always having to contend with it. But white people, unless we are actively involved in trying to address these issues, can pretty much go through our days not being aware, not really thinking about the impact that race has on us. And so what Robin DiAngelo does in this book, and what I want to try and get us to think about in the next couple minutes, begins to ask some questions about how do we respond when the topic of race or when people of different races come into our lives and into our space. So I want to begin by asking you to think about and to respond to a few statements that Robin DiAngelo makes. And you can either respond for yourself, or you can respond maybe more broadly for maybe the white people that you know in your life. And the first statement that she makes that I want us to respond to is that white people in North America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race. And white people are the beneficiaries of that separation. So I'd be curious, what do you think about that? Is that something you think is true? Do you have questions about part of it? Do you think she's stating it correctly? Is she overstating it? Is she understating it? What is your response to this statement by Robin DiAngelo? Any thoughts?
I agree that it is separate and unequal. Sometimes I wonder, how are we beneficiaries? Or in some ways we benefit, maybe economically, but in many other ways we lose by being separate.
Can you say more about that, Chris? What do you mean by that? How do you lose?
We lose by not being able to interact with people with different cultural experiences, different ideas, different experiences in life. And I think we lose by not having those interactions.
I think that's a great insight. I think in many ways you're right. We're sort of handcuffed when it comes to that idea of being able to interact with people because it's not something we're accustomed to doing. Any other reactions to that statement? Any other thoughts? You know, when I think of that statement, just thinking about it now, at least where I live, you know, people will say, "Oh, that's a nice neighborhood," or "Oh, that's a dangerous neighborhood." It's almost without anybody even using the word race. Most people would assume that the nice neighborhood is a predominantly white neighborhood, and they would assume that the not so nice neighborhood is a neighborhood primarily of Black people or Hispanic people or some other group. And you don't need, what's interesting is you don't even have to use the word race, and yet you can talk about race. There's a author by the name of Ian Haney Lopez who talks about this use of language in politics. He calls it dog whistle politics, that you can talk about race by using code words like that's a good neighborhood or that's a bad neighborhood. And never use the word race, but be talking about race all the time. And but I also really appreciate what you had to say, Chris, because I do think this is your comment about we don't know how to interact well with people of other races is one of the downsides of racism. One of the things we lose out in the way our society has evolved and developed. And so it becomes a challenge to us. Okay, how do we change that? How do we change that? Any other thoughts on this statement? Any other responses?
So I live in Rochester in an area called Brighton, and it has one of the best schools in the nation, and we have high taxes that pay for this good school. But right next to us are the public schools in Rochester that are way in debt, that they're firing all these teachers right now. And it just, what is so wrong with this picture where we have this wonderful school? And there's lots of nationalities in it, but the money is a big issue, and there's so much poverty in the inner city and violence. You know, it's just so dramatic, the difference. And in that poverty area is largely a Black community.
So yeah, that's a very graphic picture you paint, and that almost adjacent to each other. We have a situation here in Philadelphia. We have two schools that are a mile apart. One is Overbrook High School, which is famous for being the high school that Wilt Chamberlain graduated from. And a mile away is Lower Merion High School, which is this high school that Kobe Bryant, who just recently passed away, graduated from. Overbrook is in Philadelphia, and like Rochester, the way you describe Rochester is predominantly Black, at least in this area, that its school is, and very rundown and very underfunded. Lower Merion is a upper middle class suburb just outside the city, and every child who goes to that high school is given a tablet, an iPad computer to help them with their schoolwork, and they have all sorts of amenities in that school, and they're just a mile apart. And a lot of it has to do with socioeconomics, and a lot of it has to do with race. And so, yeah, these separations are really, really stark. And while they may have their roots in decisions that were made 100 years ago, the effects are still being felt because the poverty is still there and the discrepancy is still there. I want to share another statement that Robin DiAngelo makes, and like this other statement, get your response, get your thoughts. Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldview as a challenge to our very identities as good moral people. Now, she's talking about white people here. White people socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that they are either, I'm missing a word there, that they are either unaware of or can never admit to. We become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider it a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good moral people. Any responses to that statement? Any thoughts about that?
I made a bad racial mistake statement several weeks ago, and somebody recommended I read a book called Power, Privilege, and Difference. And I did have that reaction of, wait a minute, I'm a good person. Why do I have to feel bad about myself? And then I read the book, and I've been talking with a lot of people and realized that, yeah, I made some basic mistakes, and I've got a steep learning curve. And so I'm working on it. And I don't feel anymore as it's a challenge to my morality. It's a flaw in something I've been blind to, and I'm working on it now.
Wow, thank you. What's the name of the book again?
Power, Privilege, and Difference.
Power, Privilege, and Difference.
Written in 2001.
Wonderful, okay. That's a good resource. Sounds like a great resource. You know, one of the things that I'll talk about more next time as we get into this is when you have those challenges, if we can sort of remind ourselves that, oh, okay, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling challenged here, I'm feeling a little uneasy, what's going on with me? And use it as a sort of a teaching tool or a reminder that, oh, I've got something I've got to work on. But yeah, and I would add to what she says here that not only might we be socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority, but also in our socialization, in the way we were raised, most of us who are white, we've really not been taught how to have conversations about race, or even to think about ourselves as we ourselves having a race. And so we don't know how to talk about this. We don't know how to think about it. It's not something that that's been ingrained in us. And that is very different for most people of color who live in our society. Because they are a minority, they're always having to negotiate in themselves and with the people in their lives how they're going to respond when they encounter people of different races who may not look on them favorably. And so simply for a matter of survival, they have had to learn how to talk about race, how to think about race, how to negotiate race, how to deal with the stress that racism sometimes impinges upon them. All of these things that when you live in a society where you're the dominant group, you just don't have to think about. It's not that you're bad persons or that your parents were bad persons, but that it was something in our upbringing that we have missed. And now we're less able to handle things because of it. Kind of like Chris was saying, we have difficulty sometimes dealing with people of different races. So what does she mean by fragility? And this is her description or definition. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, including the outward display of anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. First, I want to note that she states that talking about race and even dealing with issues of race, or either talking about with other white people or dealing with people of other races, can be a source of stress for us. It's uncomfortable. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is. It's one of those things that for many of us who have been raised in this culture, grown up in this country, who are white, that is an inherently stressful thing. And being aware that it's stressful prepares us to deal with it. But the thing about white fragility, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in specifics in a moment here, is that it's that reaction we have that says, oh, I don't want to be in this place. I don't want to be in this conversation. I want to be somewhere else. And in my experience, both working with students and just talking with people that I know, this is very true, that very many of the white people, if I go to a social event, for instance, which is predominantly made of white people, and I mention something about race or maybe something in the news that has happened that it has a racial element to it, it's amazing to me how quickly the topic changes. I kid people that when I was growing up, people said, you know, when you go to social situations, don't talk about religion or money, religion or politics rather. And I find it very easy to talk about religion and politics, but it's race that often creates some funny reactions. People just kind of walking away or changing the subject or getting very nervous. And so the challenge is to, okay, what are the ways in which white fragility manifests itself? So she then talks about maybe what are some of the reasons that talking about race can be so uncomfortable for people. And the first that we've already mentioned is we don't regularly talk about race and racism. It's not something that we are accustomed to doing. And the fact that you all are here on a Tuesday night is a great tribute to you, that you're willing to talk and think about these things, because many of our white peers are very hesitant to do that. Another thing is there's still many whites in our society, and you may have been like this at some point in your life. I know I was, that we don't even think of ourselves as having a race. You know, there are many times when white people have been interviewed and asked, what is your race? And they say, well, I'm just American. I'm just normal. They don't think of themselves as white. And yet, if you're going to be thinking of other people as black or brown or whatever, inherently, implicitly, you're saying you are white. And yet we so normalized whiteness that we don't even think of ourselves as having a race. There are, in our culture, I think, sometimes social taboos about talking openly about race. There are people who think that even recognizing someone's race is inherently racist. I had a conversation with the woman who cuts my hair a couple of months ago, and she was telling me about her son who has two black, he's white, and he has two black friends. And her son came home one day and made some comment about his two black friends. And his mother, the boy's mother, the woman who cuts my hair, was just horrified that he had noticed their race. And there's something out there among some white people who think, if I even notice someone's race, that makes me racist. And so it's very hard for us to talk about race because we think it's socially unacceptable. As I've said many times already, that we often think of racism as an accusation, good or bad, rather than a description of our condition. It's a condition we want to change, right? But it starts with recognizing that that's part of who we are as white people in this culture, and how we're going to deal with it. A lot of people have fear and guilt when the topic of race comes up. I've taught courses in race and ethnic relations for about 20 years. And after a couple of years, I started telling the students, I'd say to the white students, in about 6 weeks, you're going to feel overwhelming guilt and shame. And it's not because of anything I'm going to try and do, but it's just this topic stirs this up in you. And invariably, I was right. Just even thinking and talking about the topic of racism can often stir up guilt in people because of things that they feel they should know, but they just don't understand, that they're not aware of. And some of us have inherited a cultural and family legacy of racism. And it's anti-Black, it's anti-Native American, those who aren't Christian, those who are immigrants. And that legacy is still very much with us. We thought maybe after the Civil Rights Movement and maybe after President Obama was elected, we'd somehow gotten past that. But what we've seen in the last 10 years is that that legacy is asserting itself in ways that it hadn't in years before. Can any of you think of any other reasons why people might feel uncomfortable talking about race? These are some of the suggestions that Robin DiAngelo has made, but I was wondering if any of you had any other things that you could think about that make it difficult for people to talk about race.
My name is Verna Zook, and I'm from East Union. I think at least in my past, I can think of things that I was told as a child in the church that now I am horrified. Yes, we sang the song, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red, brown, yellow, black, and white, all are precious in his sight. And we had that. But I remember people saying that, well, actually the idea that from Genesis, from the story of Noah, after the flood, that Africans were forever cursed, and because they were the children of whoever it was.
Ham, children of Ham, yeah.
Children of Ham. And actually as recent as about 20 or 30 years, well, 20 years ago, here at East Union, I heard that sentiment, from a dear older woman who knew her Bible. Again, I was horrified. But you know, when it kind of was mixed, who can argue with God?
Yeah.
You know, so there was that, and yeah, and now I you know, feel tremendous guilt, and like I say, I'm horrified. I remember as a young person, we had a speaker at church, and he talked about he was supposed to be talking about marriage and family, and he talked about interracial marriage, and that it was not a good idea because the children would not be accepted by either race.
Yeah.
You know, and that was from the pulpit. So, you know, we have, yeah, the guilt and but on the other hand, Jesus loves all the children.
Yeah, no, you know, that story about not marrying across race, I wasn't even dating a person of color, but my mother gave me a long talk about don't get mixed up with a black woman because the children will be forever haunted. And, you know, I don't even know what prompted that, because my mother, in other ways, was a very open-minded person. But yeah, and, you know, you mentioned the church, and I think, and the question of the church came up last time too. Unfortunately, the church has been a facilitator of some of these teachings that really drive us apart, and certainly this, you know, the idea that the people of Ham were somehow forever cursed, and that was reference to African. Certainly, you know, the idea, the passages in Paul that talk about slavery are problematic, and you know, we're still grappling with this in many ways in the church. It's an ongoing struggle. So what are some of the uncomfortable feelings that come when we run into these? And we've already mentioned some of them, but oftentimes people will feel insulted. And how dare you call me racist? Or how dare you call out something I said? And with that, they feel attacked, they feel judged, they feel singled out. Shame is often a big thing that I encounter, especially with white people who really want to get a handle on this race thing, that really want to do something different. One of the things that I think a lot of times people have to work through is their own shame of things they may have done, things that they've grown up with, things that they have sort of imbibed. And it's often very tough. Some others are anger. People get very upset that you would, and certainly guilt, fear of retribution, fear just walking in or driving in a predominantly black neighborhood, or driving in an area where there's just a lot of Native Americans. We sometimes these racial fears can get stirred up in us as if these people are going to come after us. And feeling accused. These are some of the uncomfortable feelings. Are there any other feelings that people can think of that sometimes get stirred up when the topic of race comes up? Any other feelings other than the ones that I've listed here? And these feelings are feelings that we experience, that Robin DiAngelo says are signs of white fragility, that the very topic of race can stir up these kinds of feelings. And with those feelings often come behaviors. So people will get outraged, people get just outright angry or very defensive. How dare you say that? Sometimes, and particularly women, will result to crying because it's so overwhelming, and often denial, you know, that's just not true. I didn't say that. Physical and emotional withdrawal. When I was talking earlier about, you know, going into a social situation and talking about something that has to do with race, how people were physically and emotionally just sort of withdraw, and changing the subject, just avoiding it. It's a topic that is very hard for folks to talk about and would just not want to do it. And so, you know, the challenge for for those of us who really want to engage this issue and want to engage the people who we care about around issues of race, is we ought to recognize that we may encounter some of these kinds of reactions from people, and it's a natural reaction to the fact that we are very fragile in terms of talking about race, this idea of white fragility. And same thing, that we might experience these feelings and want to do these things ourselves. That this is being aware that these sorts of things can get stirred up in us is a first step in beginning to change the way we respond. And so I share these not to kind of just say, oh man, we are just messed up. There's no hope for us. No, it's more to kind of give us a checklist to say, okay, I'm feeling a little defensive here. I'm feeling like I just like to deny this whole thing. I just want to get out of the room. What's going on with me? Why am I so reacting so to this topic, which is so central to our life as Christians and certainly our culture? And so what Robin DiAngelo sort of says at the end is that the antidote to white fragility is to build up our stamina to bear witness to the pain of racism we cause, not to impose conditions that require people of color to continually validate our denial. There's a lot in that statement, but let me unpack a couple things. The first is, one of the consequences of white people reacting in the ways that and I described in the last couple of slides, is that when we are in a context where there are people of color often feel like they have to somehow make it easy for us. They have to sort of deny their own needs and suppress their own opinions and their own values so that we won't get too upset. We white people won't get too upset. And that's what she means by continually validate our denial of racism and denial of our need to get over it. But the other thing is, and this is the tough part, is that we need to build up our stamina when we experience that pain and realize that while we may feel uncomfortable, what's even more important is that by not dealing with our own racism, we are causing great pain to the people of color in our lives and in our country at large. That that our need to deal with our own racism is not only for ourselves, but it is so that everybody across racial divides can get along in a more authentic and in a way with integrity. And so next time, this is kind of coming to a close here. Next time, I really want to talk about, okay, how can we build up our stamina? What are some of the things that we can do to really deal with our own legacy of racism? And how can we help the others in our lives who need this same help, but don't know how to get it? And so that's what I wanted to share tonight. And so we have a few minutes to deal with any questions or concerns that anyone has. So any thoughts you'd like to share?
I'm working with a family that's refugees from Congo, and I have just recently
Oh, she froze.
If I jump into this, I'll get to know some of the African Americans that are in my inner city. But no, they are proud to call themselves Africans.
Yeah.
And they have different dynamic. They don't have all the baggage the African Americans do.
Yeah, that's true. And that's often a interesting misperception that we make, is that, when you come from a culture where your race is honored and valued, you don't, like you say, you don't carry the baggage, you don't carry the burdens that come from living in a culture where being Black is really looked down upon and has been historically. So, and interesting, often there are tensions between Africans and African Americans around some of those things, because sometimes the African Americans feel like the Africans are somehow looking down on them, and the Africans feel like the African Americans just aren't welcoming them. So it's you know, it's a cultural clash, but you're right. Any other comments or thoughts?
This is Dennis from Freeman, South Church. One of my biggest frustrations working in the African culture in Zaire many years ago was the inevitable call to come to the front of the line. When there was a line for at the store or wherever, I would immediately be singled out and called to come to the front. The line in front of me would disappear or at least move way off to the side. And my protests made no difference. It was a stalemate. And I just found that situation so frustrating to deal with, and don't really know what the best way to deal with it was.
Yeah, I had the same experience a couple of years ago when I went to Kenya. And yeah, it's the legacy of colonialism that is still very strong in some of those countries. And I had the similar dilemma. And it was interesting. In my case, there was a group from the United States, from Philadelphia. We were actually an interracial group. So we had Black people and white people, although to Africans, in many cases, the Black people from America are still white in their mind. They'll still think of them as white. But I remember there was an African lady and I went to a cash machine, went to not to a cash machine, but to a place where we could exchange our dollars for Kenyan dollars. And, you know, I got mine in about 30 seconds, and my colleague, who was African-American, it took her about 5 minutes because they had to check out all sorts of things. So even there was racial discrimination against her by Africans. It's, yeah, the legacy of colonialism in Africa is really sort of mind-boggling. And I had the same experience and the same dilemma. It's really true. Yes, sir.
For me, can you hear me?
Yes.
For me, one of the major ways of building stamina is to tell my story, like I did, you know, half an hour ago, because it helps other people identify with maybe the same kinds of things that they grew up with, and it also tends to eliminate the shame. That's just the way it was.
Right.
I love my dad. May he rest in peace. He gave me many good things. But
but that one thing, yeah.
But that one thing is really important to talk about.
Yeah, that, you know, you're anticipating one of the things I want to say next week, because I think understanding our story and being able to tell it is really true. I really appreciate that. And when you're a child, or even when you're a young adult, when you're still forming your sense of identity, you don't know some things. And boy, you know, I often say, if I knew today, I knew when I was 25 what I knew today, you know, my life would have been so different, but I couldn't have got to where I am today had I not gone through that process. So, but yeah, thank you so much for that. Any other last comments? I think we're about done, aren't we, Chris, here?
We're getting close to our time limit.
Yeah.
If anyone has a last comment, feel free yet.
What? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
We had several different situations. One, in Africa, of course, our children would be vaccinated with fresh needles and new syringes. And the rest of the African children were just all shot along the line, the same needle. The other thing, the older missionaries, like you say, colonialism, the older missionaries had a lot different attitude about their house help than we did. we felt humiliated by the way we felt that they were being treated, and wanted to incorporate them more into our daily life if we could. And we were told, you can't do that because they won't work for you if you treat them that way. And the other situation was on a trip to Mexico in a bus tour. We came in fine into the United States, but our wonderful guide and bus driver were absolutely mistreated at the border by the immigration people. It was so embarrassing. Here we had been with them for 10 days, and here they had to be treated like that when they came into the United States. It was just very embarrassing for us.
Yeah. And you know, those are the times when we need to reflect on what does it mean to be an ally? How can we be allies? Because I think that's one of the things that, as we're concerned about this, we really need to think of what can we do in those situations to align ourselves with people who are being mistreated or being put down. That's such a powerful story. Yeah. Well, Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right. Thank you, Drick. And thanks to all of you who tuned in and were brave enough to contribute to the discussion. We appreciate that very much. And we look forward to seeing you next week again. Spread the word and see if we can get a few more people out. And so we'll just say good night, and we will see you again next week.
Thank you.